A 33-year-old model was allegedly attacked by her millionaire boyfriend. Her injuries were so severe that doctors had to remove part of her skull just to save her life. But while she lay seriously injured in a Moscow hospital, her friends and family continued receiving messages from her phone. Those messages made everyone believe that she was fine and simply didn't want to speak to anyone. For days, almost no one realized what had actually happened to her. By the time her family finally found Anzhelika Tartanova, she had already undergone emergency brain surgery, and the man suspected of attacking her was nowhere to be found. Anzhelika Tartanova, 33 years old. She grew up in the Mostovsky district of Krasnodar Krai in southern Russia. She had previously been married and had a son. Later, Anzhelika moved to Moscow, where she began building a life for herself and developing her modeling career. It was also in Moscow that she met Dmitry Kuzmin. Kuzmin was 41 years old at the time. He was a businessman who ran a company involved in road construction. The two quickly became romantically involved and eventually began living together. Their relationship lasted for about 6 months. By November 2025, the relationship was beginning to come to an end. On November 23, 2025, Anzhelika met with Kuzmin again. That day would change her life forever. November 23, 2025. Anzhelika and Kuzmin met at a residence on Universitetsky Prospect in Moscow. That evening, for reasons that remain unclear, the two got into an argument. The argument then quickly escalated into violence. Anzhelika suffered severe injuries to her head. Despite how badly she had been injured, she remained conscious for some time. Anzhelika found a landline telephone inside the residence and called the emergency services herself. Paramedics soon arrived at the scene. Anzhelika was rushed into an ambulance and taken to a hospital. On the way to the hospital, Anzhelika's condition began to deteriorate. She told medical personnel that she had been attacked by someone she knew, but she did not identify that person by name. At the same time, her level of consciousness became unstable. Inside the ambulance, she repeatedly lost consciousness, then briefly regained it. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors discovered that her injuries were far more serious than they appeared. She had suffered a subdural hematoma, while the brain tissue itself had also been damaged. Even more dangerously, her brain had begun to swell severely. There is only a limited amount of space inside the skull. If the swelling continued, the increasing pressure inside her skull could become life-threatening. Doctors had to act immediately. Anzhelika underwent emergency brain surgery. To reduce the pressure inside her skull, surgeons had to temporarily remove a large section of her skull, giving the swollen brain tissue room to expand. The operation saved her life, but over the next several days, Anzhelika remained in extremely serious condition. She was placed in intensive care and experienced severe problems with consciousness and memory. When she first arrived, she was briefly able to give her name. But as the effects of her injuries became apparent, her cognitive state became deeply confused. The severe memory damage even left her temporarily unable to recognize her own relatives. At the same time, her ability to speak was also severely affected. But while doctors were fighting to save Anzhelika's life, outside the hospital, something very strange was happening. After November 23rd, Anzhelika was no longer seen by her family or friends. But at first, no one immediately considered her missing, because even though they couldn't see Anzhelika, her phone was still responding to messages. When family and friends texted her, they received replies. From those messages, it appeared that nothing serious had happened to Anzhelika. She was simply busy, unable to meet anyone, and unable to speak over the phone. At first, those text messages were enough to reassure the people closest to her, but one day passed, then another. No one actually heard Anzhelika's voice, and no one actually saw her. Her family began asking to speak with her directly, but every time, there seemed to be a new explanation for why she couldn't answer the phone. One explanation was that there were problems with communications in Moscow, so she was temporarily unable to make calls. Her family also noticed that some of the replies coming from Anzhelika's phone wouldn't arrive until after 8 at night, sometimes even later. Gradually, the messages stopped reassuring them. Instead, they began raising suspicion, because this way of communicating felt less and less like Anzhelika. So her sisters began looking for her. They started asking around, trying to find out where Anzhelika had last been seen. Eventually, her family began posting missing person notices online. After nearly 2 weeks of searching, the family finally received word. Anzhelika had been found. By the time her family arrived at the hospital, nearly 2 weeks had passed since Anzhelika was injured. And the Anzhelika they saw was completely different from the woman they had last seen. She had suffered severe brain trauma and undergone emergency surgery. Her speech, memory, and physical coordination had all been affected. The severe memory damage had even left her temporarily unable to recognize her own relatives. But at least, her family finally knew one thing: Anzhelika was alive. However, this left behind a question that has never been fully explained. If Anzhelika had been able to give her name when she first arrived at the hospital, why did her family receive no word for nearly 2 weeks? Public reports have never provided a complete and clear explanation, but now, her family faced another, much more immediate question. If Anzhelika had been lying seriously injured in a hospital since November 23rd, then who had been using her phone to reply to them all this time? After Anzhelika was found, the text messages that had once seemed reassuring suddenly became one of the most suspicious clues in the entire case. Because her family now knew that the real Anzhelika could not possibly have been sending those messages normally. The investigation began to focus on Dmitry Kuzmin. He was suspected of taking and using Anzhelika's phone while she was hospitalized, pretending to be her and communicating with her family and friends. Investigators suspected that the purpose of these messages was to create an illusion, to make everyone believe that nothing had happened to Anzhelika, and those messages did succeed in delaying the moment when her family became suspicious. Meanwhile, investigators began searching for Dmitry Kuzmin, but they discovered that Kuzmin was no longer at his previous residence. Police began tracking his whereabouts. Over the following days, police continued searching for Dmitry Kuzmin. Meanwhile, Anzhelika remained in the hospital, beginning what would become a long recovery. Then, in December 2025, investigators finally located Kuzmin. He was subsequently arrested. The criminal case against him then entered its next stage. The case was handled under Article 111 of the Russian Criminal Code, concerning the intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm. Prosecutors accused Kuzmin of using violence against Anzhelika, causing severe injuries that endangered her life. If convicted, he could face up to 10 years in prison. But what happened next was a decision that deeply dissatisfied Anzhelika's side. The court did not order Kuzmin to be held in pre-trial detention. Instead, he was allowed to remain under house arrest while the case was being investigated. The reason was that Kuzmin's side submitted medical records showing that he suffered from a serious heart condition. The court ultimately declined to place him in detention. Anzhelika's side then appealed the decision, hoping the court would reverse it and order Kuzmin into pretrial detention. So at this point, two things were happening at the same time. On one side, the criminal case was continuing. On the other, Anzhelika was learning how to live again. At the hospital, Anzhelika's life had been saved, but surviving was only the first step. The severe brain injury made many things that once required no thought at all suddenly difficult. Her ability to speak was affected, there were gaps in her memory, her physical coordination was also impaired, she needed long-term rehabilitation to regain some of her most basic abilities. At the same time, her skull had still not been fully restored. The section of her skull that doctors had removed to relieve the life-threatening pressure would eventually need to be reconstructed through another operation. Doctors began planning a custom-made 3D printed implant to repair the missing section of her skull, but while Anzhelika was working to recover, the case took another turn. In January 2026, her lawyer had previously filed an appeal challenging the decision to place Kuzmin under house arrest, but by the end of January, that appeal was withdrawn. As for why it was withdrawn, public reports offered different accounts. Some media outlets, citing her lawyer, reported that Kuzmin had begun covering part of Anzhelika's medical expenses, but later, Anzhelika herself gave a noticeably different account during a public interview. She said that Kuzmin had not been involved in her rehabilitation. Therefore, exactly what caused Anzhelika's side to withdraw the appeal has never been consistently explained in public reports. What can be confirmed is simply this: the appeal seeking to have Kuzmin placed in pretrial detention was ultimately not pursued further. Several months passed, and Anzhelika's condition slowly began to improve. She relearned how to speak, she began regaining her ability to move, and her memory slowly began to return. Later, she made her first public appearance on Russian television, where she spoke about her recovery, but part of her memory never returned. Anzhelika said that she still could not fully remember what happened on November 23rd. She knew that she had been seriously injured, but she could not fully reconstruct what caused the argument, or everything that happened that night. The severity of her injuries also left her with a significant psychological impact. She later recalled that during the early stages of her recovery, for a long time, she could not even bring herself to look in a mirror. She was afraid of seeing herself after the injuries. But as her recovery continued, Anzhelika began facing her life again. Doctors also began preparing for the next stage of her treatment, reconstructing the missing section of her skull. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Dmitry Kuzmin was still ongoing. The case continued under the charge of intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm. However, the case would never reach a verdict. At the end of April 2026, about 5 months after Anzhelika was attacked, sudden news emerged. Dmitry Kuzmin had died. At the time, the criminal case against him had still not reached a final verdict. According to statements later provided to Russian media by his lawyer, Kuzmin had suffered from serious heart problems for a long time and had previously undergone heart surgery. He was ultimately reported to have died from heart-related problems. At the time of his death, the court had not yet reached a final verdict of guilt or innocence in Anzhelika's case. As a result, the case came to a very unusual ending. The man accused of attacking Anzhelika was dead, but he had never been formally convicted by a court in connection with the case. The legal process simply stopped there. For Anzhelika, whether the case was over or not, could never return her life to what it had been before November 23, 2025. She survived, but the severe brain injury changed the course of her life. She would need to continue long-term rehabilitation. Her speech, memory, and physical coordination would all require time to recover. She would also need further reconstructive treatment for her skull, using a custom-made implant to repair the defect left by the surgery. And when it comes to what happened on the night of November 23rd, some questions still remain unanswered. What caused the argument to begin? Will the memories Anzhelika lost ever return? Why did her family have no idea where she was for nearly 2 weeks after she entered the hospital? And if the case had actually reached the end of a trial, what verdict would the court have delivered? Those questions may now never be fully answered. Anzhelika, meanwhile, must continue facing what this case truly left behind. Not a court verdict, but a long road to recovery. She survived, but from November 23, 2025, her life was changed forever.